Suge Knight, one of the founders of Death Row Records, has a lot to say, and he certainly did when I talked to him about Sean Combs' racketeering and sex trafficking trial. Suge Knight, speaking from prison about Sean Combs' sex trafficking trial as his one-time music industry rival, the bad boy for life, fights to stay out of prison for life. I talk with Suge about the trial, Combs' sex life, and what he says Puffy should do next.
It's not right to blame everything on Puffy. It's just not right.
When the news broke that legal filings were suddenly mentioning Diddy dozens of times in connection to Tupac's case, people thought it was just another internet rumor. But then something changed. Names that had floated in conspiracy forums for decades were now appearing in official paperwork. Old statements were being re-examined. Conflicting stories were resurfacing, and one question quietly returned to the surface. What if this case was never as random as it looked? For years, the narrative felt simple. A street altercation, a retaliation, a tragic outcome, case closed. But the deeper you look, the less simple it becomes. Because if this was just street retaliation, why were so many powerful industry names orbiting the story from the very beginning? Why were there contradictory hospital accounts? Why were there claims of money changing hands? And why are investigators still reopening pieces of this decades later? Before we go further, I need to ask you something. Do you believe this was purely street retaliation, or do you think someone powerful helped shape what happened that night? Comment below what you think. I'm genuinely curious where you stand. And if you want breakdowns like this, where we separate rumor from documented contradictions, make sure you subscribe.
I remember on Bob First, you actually blamed Suge for Tupac getting killed.
Yeah.
Because it should have been up to him to protect him better.
Because what we're about to walk through is not what most people think. Now here's where things start getting uncomfortable. On the night everything unfolded, Tupac wasn't alone. He was with Suge Knight. Windows down, public location, high visibility. For someone considered a target security, that night looked surprisingly relaxed. That's the first thing investigators questioned. Why was there no serious protection protocol in place? Suge later described Tupac as recovering well in the hospital, laughing, conscious, responsive. But other accounts painted a very different picture, describing him as heavily sedated and unresponsive.
Last time me and Tupac was on the same page, and I did an interview with Angie Martinez, and she asked me how did I feel about Puffy and Biggie, and I told her that I like their music and I want to do music with them. Death Row didn't like that, Tupac didn't like that, so we had a misunderstanding. So on the flight back to LA, I didn't feel comfortable around them for what they had did, as far as I didn't let my security ride with me. So to protect myself and to prevent from happening, I slept under a blanket with the knife and the fork just in case something was to go wrong, but it didn't.
Two completely different versions of the same moment. And in investigations like this, contradictions matter. Because when stories don't align, it forces one of two conclusions. Either memories are flawed, or someone isn't telling the full truth. Then there's the bigger question. Motive. Street retaliation explains part of it. There had been tension earlier that night, an altercation, pride involved, reputation involved. But street retaliation doesn't explain why certain industry rivalries were at their peak. It doesn't explain financial incentives being whispered about. And it definitely doesn't explain why a former associate later claimed money had been offered to handle the situation. That claim changed everything. Because once money enters the conversation, it stops being random. And this is where Diddy's name keeps resurfacing. Not in a confirmed charge, not in a conviction, but in repeated mentions, in statements, in alleged conversations, in interviews that investigators later reviewed. The theory goes like this. If someone stood to gain from Tupac being removed from the picture financially, competitively, culturally, that motive becomes relevant. At the time, the East Coast versus West Coast rivalry wasn't just music. It was branding, it was territory, it was identity. And Tupac was more than an artist. He was influence, charisma, movement, Removing someone like that would shift the balance of power overnight. But here's the twist most people miss. Even if someone had motive, that doesn't mean they had control. Because the street narrative still holds weight. There were known tensions with gang affiliates. There was a physical altercation earlier that evening. And later, a car pulled up. Shots fired. Witness accounts. Confessions years later. One individual eventually admitted being in the vehicle involved. But even that confession raised eyebrows. Why? Because of the timing. Why wait so long to speak? Why discuss alleged conversations involving powerful industry figures? And why did law enforcement initially decline to move forward based on those claims? It suggests something complicated. Either the evidence wasn't strong enough, or the story was bigger than one trigger. Then we circle back to Suge Knight. Some detectives have openly questioned his version of events. Not because there's proof he orchestrated anything, but because certain decisions that night remain puzzling. Why allow vulnerability in a high-risk moment? Why were security measures inconsistent? And why were statements about Tupac's hospital condition so different from medical descriptions? Again, contradiction. Now here's where this turns from crime story into pattern recognition. When you map the rivalries, the financial tensions, the street affiliations, and the post-event narratives, you start noticing something strange. Everyone had a reason. Street figures had retaliation motives. Industry figures had competitive motives. Personal relationships introduced jealousy motives. But when everyone has a reason, the real question becomes, who had the opportunity and the influence to steer what happened afterward? Because there's another layer most people ignore. The aftermath. Who benefited from the mythology? Who gained power? Whose brand grew? Who consolidated control in the vacuum that was left behind? Some argue that removing Tupac unintentionally immortalized him, making him larger than life. Others argue that certain industry figures quietly expanded their dominance afterward. But correlation isn't proof. And that's where responsible investigation matters. You don't jump to conclusions. You follow inconsistencies. You follow incentives. You follow documented statements. And you notice when powerful names repeatedly appear in files. Now here's what makes this current development interesting. Recent legal documents connected to unrelated cases have referenced past associations and rivalries again. And when old names reappear in official paperwork, even indirectly, it forces the public to revisit old suspicions. Not because someone has been convicted, but because patterns resurface. And patterns make people uncomfortable, especially when those patterns connect music moguls, street figures, and unresolved history. So the real question isn't, were they charged? The real question is, why do their names keep coming back into the conversation after all these years? Because in cold cases, time doesn't erase suspicion. It just buries it under new headlines. And sometimes, all it takes is one legal filing to bring it back to the surface. And what we're about to examine next is the money trail theory. Because once you understand that angle, the entire narrative shifts. Follow the money. That's the rule investigators live by when motives start getting blurry. Because emotions create chaos, but money creates structure. And structured crime leaves patterns. For years, one allegation refused to disappear that a large sum of money had allegedly been discussed in connection to removing Tupac from the picture. Not proven in court, not confirmed in a conviction, but repeated enough in statements and interviews that investigators couldn't completely ignore it. The claim was simple but explosive. That someone powerful may have floated the idea of paying for the problem to disappear. Now think about what that means. Street retaliation is emotional, it's impulsive, it's pride-driven. But a financial arrangement, that's strategic. That's calculated. That suggests planning. And planning changes everything. Because if money was offered, even hypothetically, that introduces coordination beyond a random altercation. This is where one particular figure became central to the narrative. An individual later admitted to being inside the vehicle involved that night. Years later, he began speaking publicly, in interviews, in private conversations that eventually reached investigators. He described alleged discussions involving payment. He described rivalries being weaponized. He described conversations that suggested this wasn't purely street heat. But here's where things get complicated. Why speak years later? Why not immediately? And why mix alleged financial claims with already established gang retaliation? Some critics argue that delayed confessions weaken credibility. Others argue that time creates safety, and safety allows people to talk. Investigators had to weigh that. Is this a man finally clearing his conscience? Or is this someone reshaping history now that key players are gone or untouchable? Because when powerful industry figures are involved, silence often lasts longer than loyalty. Now let's examine Diddy's position in all of this. At the height of the rivalry, the East Coast and West Coast tension wasn't just personal, it was commercial. Album sales, touring power, cultural dominance, public perception. Tupac wasn't just competing musically. He was dominating narratives. He was vocal, aggressive, unfiltered, and he directly called out rivals in public forums. That kind of pressure doesn't just bruise egos. It affects business. So when allegations surfaced that money may have been discussed, investigators had to ask, who would benefit financially? Who stood to gain from silence? And who had the resources to make such an offer even possible? But again, motive is not proof. And this is where people often lose objectivity. Just because someone benefits doesn't mean they orchestrated it. History is filled with opportunistic success that followed tragedy. That alone doesn't make someone guilty. However, repeated mentions in statements, repeated associations in files, repeated resurfacing in legal documents. That's what keeps suspicion alive. And here's another layer rarely discussed. If someone did float the idea of payment, that doesn't mean they expected it to spiral into national headlines. Sometimes powerful people underestimate street consequences. They assume distance protects them. They assume intermediaries absorb the risk. And when chaos unfolds, plausible deniability becomes the shield. Now let's bring Suge Knight back into the picture. Because if there was any external financial influence, it would have required proximity. Access, knowledge of movements, understanding of security gaps. Suge had proximity. He had control over Tupac's schedule. He had influence over logistics. So investigators quietly asked a sensitive question. If money was allegedly discussed, would someone inside Tupac's circle have known vulnerability points? That question doesn't accuse. It examines possibility. Because coordination requires awareness. And awareness requires access. Now think about the vulnerability that night. High visibility. Predictable destination. Windows down. Minimal visible security. For someone in the middle of escalating tensions, it was surprisingly exposed. Was that overconfidence? Or assumption that nobody would dare act publicly? Or was it simply a chain of poor decisions colliding at the worst possible time? This is where the money theory and the street retaliation theory intersect. Because it's possible both narratives are partially true. Imagine this scenario. Street tensions already exist. Emotions are high. Someone influential casually expresses a desire for the problem to disappear. That idea circulates. It reaches ears already primed for retaliation. Now what was originally emotional becomes incentivized. Not directed, not officially ordered, but encouraged by atmosphere. In complex cases, influence doesn't always look like a contract. Sometimes it looks like suggestion. And suggestion can be powerful when pride and rivalry are already boiling. Years later, when that alleged payment claim surfaced again, people expected immediate charges. But law enforcement operates differently. They need more than confession stories. They need corroboration, financial trails, recorded communication, witness alignment. And without that, allegations remain allegations. Still, the fact that those claims were formally documented at all means investigators considered them credible enough to record. And that alone keeps the theory alive. Then something else added fuel to the fire. Old interviews resurfaced where rival artists referenced knowing more than they publicly shared. Cryptic statements, half-jokes, comments implying inside knowledge. None of it concrete, but enough to stir doubt. Because when multiple figures from the same era hint at something bigger, it makes the public wonder. Were they protecting themselves? Or protecting someone else? Now here's where things get even more layered. As unrelated legal cases against powerful industry figures emerged years later, past rivalries were mentioned again in filings. Not as direct charges, but as contextual background. And suddenly, headlines reignited speculation. Because when someone is already under legal scrutiny, people revisit unresolved chapters. Patterns matter more when reputations are weakened. So even if there's no direct charge in Tupac's case, the association keeps resurfacing in legal language. And legal language carries weight. But before jumping to conclusions, there's another angle we need to explore. Because money and rivalry are only two pieces of the puzzle. There's also perception control, media narratives, public statements, the way stories were shaped in the days and years that followed. And when you examine who controlled the narrative afterward, you begin to notice something subtle. And subtle shifts often reveal more than loud accusations. Power doesn't always pull the trigger. Sometimes power shapes the story afterward. And that's where this case becomes even more uncomfortable. Because after Tupac was gone, the chaos didn't just settle. It reorganized. Look closely at what happened in the months and years that followed. The rivalry didn't end, but the tone shifted. Certain voices became louder. Certain brands expanded. Certain figures consolidated influence. And while grief dominated headlines, business quietly continued behind the scenes. This is where psychology enters the conversation. When a dominant personality disappears from a cultural battlefield, a vacuum forms. And vacuums attract control. Tupac wasn't just an artist. He was unpredictable, confrontational, direct. He publicly challenged rivals by name, including Diddy at times, and he wasn't subtle about it. That kind of presence changes rooms. When he entered a space, the energy shifted. When he released music, the narrative shifted. When he spoke, media reacted. Remove that presence and something changes. Now imagine being a rival executive during that era. Pressure building. Public disses escalating. Brand image under attack. And then suddenly silence. No more direct challenges. No more explosive interviews. No more lyrical warfare from that voice. Whether planned or not, that silence creates opportunity. And this is where suspicion around Diddy continues to echo. Not because of proof, but because of positioning. After Tupac's passing, East Coast dominance in mainstream rap expanded dramatically. Commercial success soared. Media narratives reframed the rivalry. The bad boy image became more marketable. Again, success after tragedy doesn't equal orchestration. But perception matters. And perception fuels suspicion. Now let's shift back to Suge Knight. Because proximity to the event makes his role psychologically complex. He survived that night. He was in the driver's seat. He witnessed everything unfold from feet away. And yet over time, his public statements fluctuated. At times emotional. At times defiant. At times cryptic. Some interviews suggested Tupac was conscious longer than official medical summaries described. Other accounts contradicted that. Why would details change? Trauma, memory distortion, or strategic storytelling. In high-profile incidents, survivors often carry more than grief. They carry narrative power. And whoever controls the narrative controls public belief. That's not conspiracy. That's human behavior. Now consider something deeper. When law enforcement initially handled the case, critics later argued the investigation lacked urgency. Evidence gaps, delayed coordination, interagency tension. Years passed before serious developments resurfaced. Why? Was it simply poor coordination? Or was the environment too politically sensitive at the time? When powerful music executives and influential street figures overlap, investigations can become complicated. Not necessarily corrupt, but complicated. Reputations are at stake. Financial empires are at stake. Cultural movements are at stake. And in environments like that, pressure exists even if no one says it out loud. Now here's where the psychological darkness deepens. If someone powerful even casually expressed frustration about Tupac. If someone influential implied they wished the rivalry would end permanently. If that sentiment reached the wrong ears, then the atmosphere itself becomes combustible. Not a direct order, not a signed contract, but a suggestion in the wrong ecosystem. And ecosystems matter. During that era, loyalty, pride, and retaliation weren't abstract ideas. They were currency. So when Diddy's name surfaces in statements about alleged conversations, and when Suge's proximity raises vulnerability questions, people connect dots. Maybe too quickly, but they connect them anyway. Then there's another subtle shift. Over time, public narratives began simplifying the story. It became gang retaliation. Clean, contained, digestible. But complex cases are rarely that simple. Because if it were purely gang retaliation, why did alleged payment conversations exist at all? If it were purely industry rivalry, why was street execution involved? The overlap is what keeps this unresolved in the public mind. Street muscle, industry tension, personal ego, financial stakes, all intersecting at one intersection. Now zoom out. Years later, when unrelated legal troubles began surrounding Diddy, old rivalries were referenced again in filings and media coverage. Not as charges, but as context. And context revives memory. Memory revives suspicion. And suspicion reopens cold wounds. Meanwhile, Suge Knight's legal issues in separate cases weakened his public image significantly. And when reputations fracture, people revisit past events with sharper eyes. It's human nature. We reassess history when power shifts. And power has shifted. That's why this conversation is resurfacing now. Not because of a sudden confession. Not because of a new smoking gun. But because when influential figures face legal scrutiny elsewhere, unresolved chapters resurface. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. If there truly was no deeper coordination, why do these names refuse to detach from the case? Why do they repeatedly appear in public speculation, interviews, and filings decades later? Coincidence? Or unresolved threads? But here's the most important layer. There has never been a formal conviction tying Diddy or Suge Knight directly to orchestrating Tupac's death. That remains critical. Allegations exist. Statements exist. Theories exist. But court-proven orchestration does not. And that line must stay clear. Because speculation can spiral faster than truth. Still, the psychological weight of motive, proximity, and benefit is hard for the public to ignore. And when you combine motive with opportunity, even without proof, suspicion lingers. Now we approach the final layer of this case, the one that keeps it alive in modern headlines. Because beyond money, Beyond rivalry, beyond street retaliation, there's one more question investigators quietly wrestle with. If this was truly spontaneous, why did so many powerful individuals appear prepared for the aftermath? And that's where this story reaches its most unsettling territory. Prepared for the aftermath. That's the part no one talks about long enough. Because chaos is loud, but preparation is quiet. And when you study major historical events, not just in music, but in politics, business, even war, one pattern repeats itself over and over again. The event shocks the public. The aftermath reveals who was ready. After Tupac was gone, statements came quickly. Narratives formed quickly. Positions solidified quickly. Industry momentum didn't stall, it redirected. Now that alone doesn't prove orchestration. But it does raise an uncomfortable question. In moments of true unpredictability, people scramble. They hesitate. They adjust slowly. But in this case, certain empires didn't hesitate at all. They expanded. Again, expansion is not guilt. But timing shapes perception. And perception shapes suspicion. When people look at Diddy's trajectory in the years that followed, they see dominance. Commercial growth. Cultural influence. Award stages. Global branding. Meanwhile, Suge Knight's power arc moved in the opposite direction over time: legal battles, instability, eventual incarceration in an unrelated case. Power diverged. One empire stabilized. The other fractured. And when power shifts that dramatically, history gets re-examined. Now let's step back and remove emotion completely. Strip away rivalry. Strip away loyalty. Strip away fan bias. Look only at structural elements. There was street tension that night. There were industry rivalries at peak intensity. There were allegations of financial discussions. There were contradictory hospital narratives. There were delayed investigative developments. There were later confessions. And there were repeated resurfacing mentions in legal filings decades later. None of those individually prove orchestration. But together, they create gravity. Gravity doesn't scream. It pulls. That's why this case never fully leaves public consciousness. Because gravity keeps pulling it back into headlines. Now here's something even darker. If someone powerful had indirectly influenced events, even casually, would they ever admit it? No. Influence at that level rarely leaves fingerprints. It leaves atmosphere. And atmosphere is nearly impossible to prosecute. This is where the difference between legal truth and public belief becomes clear. Legally, without concrete, direct, corroborated evidence, charges don't stick. Publicly, patterns are enough to fuel suspicion indefinitely. And that's exactly what's happening now. When newer legal controversies began surrounding Diddy in unrelated matters, the public lens sharpened. Old rivalries were mentioned again. Old quotes resurfaced. Old interviews circulated. Because when someone's image weakens, people reassess everything connected to their past. It doesn't mean the past changes. It means scrutiny increases. The same applies to Suge Knight. As his legal troubles mounted over time, public sympathy faded. And when sympathy fades, suspicion grows. It becomes easier for audiences to imagine darker possibilities. But imagination is not evidence. And that line must stay clear. Now consider the psychological layer. If Tupac was as dominant, as influential, and as culturally explosive as history remembers him, then his absence reshaped an entire industry ecosystem. Vacuum, realignment, consolidation. Those things happened. Undeniably. The question is not whether the industry shifted. It did. The question is whether anyone quietly anticipated that shift. That's the unsettling part. Because anticipation implies foresight. And foresight implies awareness. And awareness implies proximity to risk. Was it just coincidence that tensions peaked publicly right before that night? Was it coincidence that street retaliation aligned with industry rivalry timing? Was it coincidence that alleged payment claims surfaced later? Maybe. History is full of coincidences. But history is also full of calculated risks. What makes this case uniquely haunting is that we may never know which category it belongs to. Because key players are gone. Memories fade. Statements evolve. And time distorts clarity. All that remains are fragments. Fragments of interviews. Fragments of legal language. Fragments of confessions. Fragments of suspicion. And two names that refuse to detach from the narrative, Diddy and Suge Knight. Not because they were convicted of orchestrating anything, but because their influence during that era was too large to ignore. When you operate at the highest levels of culture, every event near you becomes magnified. Fairly or unfairly. That's the cost of power. Now here's the final uncomfortable truth. If this was purely street retaliation, then the industry rivalry narrative will always feel exaggerated. If this was influenced by industry tension, then the street retaliation narrative will always feel incomplete. And if it was a tragic collision of both, then the case becomes even more complicated than most people are ready to accept. Because complexity doesn't trend well. Simple villains do. Simple headlines do. Charged. Responsible. Orchestrated. Those words are powerful. But power in language doesn't equal legal reality. As of today, there has been no courtroom conviction proving that Diddy or Suge Knight orchestrated Tupac's death. That matters. It protects the difference between analysis and accusation. But it doesn't erase why their names continue to orbit the story. And maybe that's why this case refuses to rest. Not because it lacks answers entirely, but because the answers that exist don't silence the bigger questions. Who truly benefited? Who truly lost? Who knew more than they admitted? And who simply got caught in the storm of an era that was already combustible? Some mysteries fade with time. This one intensifies, because every time power shifts, every time new legal documents surface, every time an old rival speaks, the gravity returns. And until every contradiction is reconciled, until every allegation is either proven or permanently dismissed, the shadows around that night will remain exactly where they've always been. Close enough to see, but never clear enough to touch.